Hello, welcome. So I'm here because my kids said I should make a video and put it on YouTube about something I know. And the first thing that popped into my head was, well, I collect antique Japanese swords. I bought a lot of them on eBay. So how not to get scammed buying Japanese swords on eBay. I've done pretty well on eBay over the last 20 something years, even though it really can be a minefield, as people say. It really can be. So the first thing you have to consider, though, when it comes to eBay is, or any purchase of swords, is your budget. What are you willing to spend? If it's upwards of 10, 20 grand and you've got like a ton of money and you can spend, good for you. eBay may not be the place you want to buy. You want to go to a reputable site, Nihanto.com. Nihanto.us is another good one. There are other good ones too, which I might name in a later video. And the other thing you have to consider is, I want like a long sword, a katana, or am I okay with a shorter sword, wakizashi, tanto? The wakizashi tanto are considerably cheaper overall than the katana, the long swords, which is anything over about 24 and a half inches. There are other Japanese measurements like sun and bun, but we're not going to get into that right now because that's a whole other thing. So the other thing you also have to consider is, am I going to collect a military sword, a military antique, or in more of a traditional antique katana? Most of the swords that are in this country came over here as a result of the Japanese surrender in World War II, probably a few 100,000. But as to how many are actually left, not that number. Because people didn't know what they had back in the day, and they would use them to chop stuff down and give them to their kids, and the kids would destroy them, whatever. So military swords are more readily accessible than the antique swords, especially when it comes to quality. And the other thing to consider is books. For God's sake, get and read thoroughly good books first. Good books are never a waste of money. If you go and investing your hard-earned money on something on eBay and you mess up and it could have been avoided with spending 40, 50, even $100 on books, well, that's something to consider. So before we go any further, I'll show you examples of swords I purchased on eBay and what I'm talking about. This is a field officer's Kyugunto, and it's just katana size. It's actually in very good shape. It has this silver Mon family crest badge. I might go into that in a later video. And the blade is also in really good shape, as you can see here. And this one got on eBay under $1,500. Pretty good, not bad. This is also a World War II era sword. And you might say, well, how come that one looks so different? Well, because until about the 1930s, they used that Kyugunto style, the Japanese military did. It's a little different for Army, Navy, and other the forces and branches. But then in the late 30s, they transitioned to this style. So this blade is also in really good shape. This is actually a Yasukuni sword, which again, we'll go into that in a later video. This was not under $1,500, but I still think I got a pretty good deal on it. And this over here is more of a traditional samurai katana. The scabbard is a little rough, but the blade is not. And the fittings are not. The blade is in really good shape, freshly polished, or fairly freshly polished. But you can actually see a lot of the details, again, which I might explain in a later video. So the first things you want to watch out for on an eBay sale, aside from what we've already gone over, is cracks, nicks, and bends, in that order. because a crack through the tempered edge, it's usually lateral. The tempered edge goes like this, and the crack is usually like this. They can be anywhere from super obvious to not obvious at all, and you have to look super close. So that renders the blade, at least the blade part, pretty much useless, or not valuable at all. So that's something to be careful about. And the other thing is nicks. Nicks in the blade, if it's even a tiny, like, thumbnail catcher nick, is time and money for a professional polisher to take out. And yes, there are professional sword polishers, and the apprenticeship, I think last I remember, is about 10 years in Japan. It's shorter to make them. It's longer to polish them. That gives you an indication as to how much goes into it. However complicated you think Japanese sword polishing could be, it's like 10 times more complicated and time consuming than that. So just don't attempt it yourself. Usually in a blade that's rough shape, even all you need is thin coat of machine oil, rub it a few times with a tissue, and you can appreciate the beauty from there. Don't go destroying something that's a valuable antique and potentially like 500 or 600 years old, please. You don't have to do that. But bear in mind that if you do send it to a professional polisher, it's at about $125 or more polishing per inch, and many of them, at least the good ones, have a few months or longer wait. But if you find something that you really like and you think it's worth the investment, maybe it's worth the wait. That being said, also ask questions of the seller. If something's not obvious, maybe it's not obvious for a reason. If you're looking at something and you're like, I can't really tell, yeah, maybe that's not by accident. So ask questions of the seller, especially if you're going to spend like hundreds or thousands of dollars. You ask them, hey, are there any cracks, bends, nicks in this blade? Let's see what they say. Maybe some of the more honest ones would be like, oh yeah, there's a bend in it, and we didn't see that at first, sorry, and then at least you know. Or there's, upon closer inspection, there's a crack, or there's a little nick up here where the camera really didn't show. That'd be nice of them to be honest. Sometimes they're a little circumspect and they'll say, oh, well, we didn't notice anything, in our opinion, That's something to watch out for. Ideally, if you're going to be spending your hard-earned money, you want something that's plainly obvious. Is all the camera views, and they're right up front about everything. So, the next step is to, with the books, make sure they're books that show quality. Because if you look at garbage, you're going to think that's normal. Especially when it comes to Japanese swords or anything Japanese, they do things to like the umpteenth extreme. Garbage is not normal. Perfection, or near close to it, is normal. So that being said, I'm going to go over a few books here that are worth the investment. We'll start with the military sword books because they're on top. I got this book years ago, Military Swords of Japan by Richard Fuller and Ron Gregory. It's really not crazy expensive. The cover is in color. The inside is not, but there's still a lot of really good descriptions in here about military swords, and even some oshigata, which are the tang rubbings of the swords in the back of the book. But that book I think is really outclassed by this book, which is more recent, Imperial Swords of Japan by Jim Dawson. This book is really good, and all the pictures are in color. It goes over many people's collections, different types of Japanese military swords in a lot of detail. And if you get this book, you look through this book, one thing you'll notice is these tend to be the best examples of those types. And you'll notice as you look through that, like, oh, this is what the quality should look like. So it pays to really look at those in detail, because then when you go to eBay, you'll be able to scroll through things and be like, ew, that doesn't look right. If something doesn't look right, it's probably not right. So, on the more collectible, antique Japanese sword books are this one. I like this one, Cutting Edge, Japanese Swords in the British Museum. The pictures, again, are in color, and there's many pictures in here of antique Japanese swords that are in fresh polish. They're really highly polished. They're in great shape. And that gives descriptions of the different characteristics of swords, the different qualities, and the eras and time periods and so forth, which I can go into more detail on in a later video because that's a whole subject in itself. And this last book is also a quality book, but this is more for, I would say, somebody who has money, and it helps if maybe you inherited a collection of fine quality swords, or you have that budget to buy a really fine quality sword for like $20,000-$30,000. The Connoisseur's Book of Japanese Swords. But if you have the buying power to be a connoisseur of Japanese swords, you're probably not buying them off of eBay. Unless you really know a lot about buying swords off of eBay. So, but the common theme with those books is look at quality. Because if you don't, you're going to look at junk after junk after junk and think like, okay, that's normal. It should look like this. The Japanese sword should look like that. No, they should not. Even the weapons of war that they made have a fine fit and finish and assembly quality to them, with some very rare exceptions. So what we went over on eBay, ask sellers questions. Don't be afraid to ask questions. If they block you or won't answer your questions because you're asking too many questions or whatever, that's another sign too. Forget about it. Then don't buy from them. And look at the feedback, profile, and rating, how long they've been on eBay, how many sales they have. There are a lot of sellers that have been on eBay for quite some time, but how many Japanese swords have they really sold? Sometimes they've been on eBay for like 15, 20 years, but they've sold, I don't know, 5 or 6, maybe 10 Japanese swords in all that time, so they're really not experts on it. They could have gotten something that wasn't even really made in Japan, made in China, most likely, and they may not know it, even if they have a very high feedback rating and they've been on eBay for quite some time. So you have to see, okay, what's the feedback profile like? How long have they been on eBay? What do they sell? And you have to think to yourself or ask yourself, am I okay with buying from international sellers? I like to stay away from Eastern Europe. Sorry, Eastern Europe, but I'd be cautious about buying or going there. Like to stay away from buying anything that's very expensive from China or Pakistan or India or anything like that. I would prefer to buy items that are close to home. United States, Canada, really that's it, United States, Canada. And Great Britain has its own problems now with the weapons exporting and importing. Sorry, Great Britain, we'll cover that in another video. And another thing you might want to consider is using Auction Sniper. Some people might say, oh, that's cheating, you're not doing it right. There's no such thing as cheating. This is capitalism. If you can do something to give yourself an edge, I say go for it. It's either that, or you've got to look out for the last few seconds of that auction if you're looking at something you're tracking, you're following, and you really like, and bid. But what something like Auction Sniper does with their algorithms is, in my experience, it also helps to reduce the effect of shill bids. What shill bids are, some sellers will have either themselves on a different account or their friends, buddies, mothers, I don't know, whatever, bid on an item, especially the last few moments, to drive the price up. And that's why you see some things that sometimes looks like they sell, and they sold to a high bidder, and then they're back on. And that leaves you wondering, like, I thought that sold. Yeah, that could be a shill bid situation, in my experience. What the Auction Sniper or other websites like that help to do is it locks in like the last possible second. So a human really usually isn't that fast unless they're really lucky. Another thing to watch out for is how long are you willing to wait for your sword. You have to check that out too. Sometimes it says, oh, seller is away until 2035 or something like that, and or they give an exporting guideline. Now, sometimes if you buy something or if you're bidding on something or following something from Japan, it gives what might seem like this crazy timeline for exporting, like several weeks or a month and a half, and you might think, oh, it's a scam. In my experience, that's not really a scam. That is about how long it takes to get something registered and ready for export and shipping something out of Japan. The Japanese don't cut corners. They're very precise with how they do things. Things take time, and everybody's just okay with it. However, that being said, is you probably may not get the deal out of a sword from Japan that you used to get. In my experience, again, about like 10 years ago, maybe more, you could get a bargain out of military swords in Japan because they weren't as highly esteemed there. They were like, oh, this is a military sword or military sword parts. We'll sell them just to get rid of them. And then they caught on because people are people and money is real. And now, just because something is for sale from Japan, it's not necessarily of high quality or a deal. You got to remember that if it's a Japanese seller, they're selling something to Americans or other gaijin that didn't sell in Japan. So the domestic market, if you will, for that item where people speak the same language, people were like, man, nobody wanted it. So what makes you think it's of any great quality that people are going to want to hear? There are other details also to look for. The whole fit and finish of a Japanese sword. Again, if the fittings look rough and the tang, that's the end of the sword, the part that goes into the handle, looks rough, or it doesn't look symmetrical with the rest of the sword, like it was finished off by a child, it might have been. So I wouldn't bid on that. Also, the writing on the tang of a Japanese sword, the chiseled inscriptions, it's usually a signature, date, or it can be. That doesn't mean that that's genuine. Again, in my experience, and from what I've heard, talking to other people and being on the discussion groups, is most, I would say like 80% of the signatures are false. They're fake. Even on a high quality item. You could have a high quality sword, it's a really nice blade, a really nice piece, and the signature is fake. Now, does it make the sword worthless? No. It just doesn't make it as valuable as a genuine signature. Not nearly as valuable as a genuine signature. And again, some of the telltale signs are, does it look like the signature has been chiseled by a jumble tool? If it does, it probably has. So don't bid on that, or if you really like the blade, bid on the blade. But don't think, okay, well, this sword is signed by a Japanese master or whatever. Even a lot of the swords that are genuinely signed, and the sword looks to be in good shape, that doesn't mean it was a Japanese master. There were a lot of Japanese smiths making swords at certain time periods, and far less so at other time periods. So you have to look out for that. There were time periods in the history of the Japanese swords where they were made pretty much mass production because there were wars and battles to be fought, and these things had to be made quickly in order to be used. And that's another thing to bear in mind. Until fairly recently, these are weapons. They were made to open up live human flesh. That was their purpose. They were made to be used as weapons. So you might see that in a sword, as much as you're not going to see any traces of blood or anything. If someone tells you, oh, that's like dried blood on the blade, it's rust. Which brings me to another topic. That's another thing to look out for. Rust and pits. You're better off having a blade that has a thin coat of like red rust than black. What black means, again, in my experience, is pits. And if you're going to send it to a polisher, And then it's a thin coat of that red rust. Again, you could stop that in its tracks with a thin coat of oil and just, rubbing it, appreciating what you got. But they'll have to remove far less metal, because you can remove it, you can't add it. They'll have to remove far less metal to get to, fresh steel, if it's just that thin coat of active rust, than if it's these black pits. And they might not be able to remove it. A good polisher will probably tell you, look, it's not worth removing a ton of metal here because you're going to destroy what you have, or you're going to end up with a toothpick. Which brings me to yet another thing to consider. Really look at the width from the back of a blade. And then you could tell also how many times it's been polished down. If it starts out wide at the tang and it narrows considerably up from there, that blade's seen quite a few polishes. And the core steel, shintetsu is what it is, the core steel could start showing through in the various parts of the blade. And that's, again, something to look out for. Speaking of various parts of the blade, it pays to read those books, familiarize yourself with what a kasaki is, a boshi, hamon. Those are all terms you're really going to want to have a good understanding of before you go spending your hard-earned money on bidding on a Japanese sword. And, well, I can't think of anything else for right now. That would be a good 101 for buying swords off of eBay. But I'll probably make future videos, and then we'll go from there. Thank you. Bye-bye.